unmuted, I think. I hope it's unmuted. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm just very briefly here to speak to get us started. Welcome to today's discussion on artificial intelligence's use in the justice system. My name is Brian Scarpelli. I am merely here on behalf of the American Bar Association Science and Technology Law Section, or SciTech, to express how excited the section is to partner with Arizona State University to convene this important and timely event. I happen to also work for a not-for-profit trade association called ACT, the App Association, which it represents the interest of small business tech developers through legal and policy advocacy. And I just mentioned that because that's sort of my day job. But in that capacity, I'm even more interested in the dialogue that's going to follow me giving these brief remarks. So just a little bit about SciTech. It is the leading section within the American Bar Association focused on the intersection of law, science, and technology, providing leadership resources and a collaborative environment for legal professionals, academics, scientists, technologists, and policymakers addressing legal issues arising from science and technological advancements. I urge you all to get involved with the SciTech community to expand your network and collaborate with judges, attorneys, academics, scientists, and other industry professionals in science and technology law. We have lots of great committees, and there are opportunities to participate in a range of in-person and virtual events, to contribute content to the SciTech section's publications and other things like that. So thank you again. And I'm going to step out of the way with that. I really should hand it over to Andrea to move things along.
Thank you, Brian. And as I've said to almost everybody, I hope this is the first of many of these joint projects that we're going to be doing with you. Just so a little bit of background about ASU in DC. This is our building. The law school occupies 2 floors here, and we get between 20 and 30 students a year who come here, and they spend up to a year and a half in Washington during the day externing. So if anybody's interested in hiring one of our brilliant students up on the Hill in different organizations, and they are then able to take classes in the evening. Classes are taught by amazing head of national security at the State Department, 2 lawyers from HRSP at DOJ. So it's a really active program. But one of the things that we're really grateful for is the Law Science Innovation Program, which is based in Phoenix, and that Professor Bowman is part of. It is a unique program that you're not going to see in any East Coast school that really is looking at the cutting edge of everything Diane and I was talking about. Her last lecture was on quantum and AI use here. We're going to discuss today in the courtroom. But a very short bio of my friend and our amazing colleague, Professor Bowman. Diana Bowman is a full professor at Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, where she serves as the Associate Dean for Applied Research and Partnerships. She's also the co-director for the Center for Smart Cities and Regions and a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society at ASU. In 2022 to 2023, Diana served as ASU University's Technology Office Innovation Fellow. She is a Plus Alliance Fellow, a Senior Sustainability Scientist in the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability, and a faculty affiliate in the Global Security Initiative at ASU. Diana is an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, class of 2018. She, just this year, took up an additional role, as if she was not busy enough, as honorary counsel for Australia to Arizona. So she's also a diplomat. So please, no further ado, Professor Diana Bowman.
Welcome to ASU Law, our panelists and our participants here. I'm so excited to be able to moderate this panel, as AI is something that I spend probably 30 to 50% of my life talking about every day these days. And I find that there's so many people in the community who are hearing bits and pieces about AI in the news, but have no idea of how that connects into their role or what that future role might look like. So I'm going to do a bit of a pop quiz and get some audience participation first. Who feels they're comfortable in terms of giving a definition of what AI is? If I was to point my random finger, put your hand up if you feel like you could confidently talk about what AI is or a definition. Okay. Who uses AI, like generative AI, on a daily basis? Okay, so we're looking at maybe 35. Who thinks that within the next year or two, you are going to be nearly forced to use generative AI to keep up in terms of your workplace. Yeah? Okay, I think that was a majority of hands. Who has concerns about that? 50%, but the level of the hand, I think, is like the indicator of how concerned people are. Well, I am really delighted today that we get to talk about AI in the criminal justice sector. I think it's an area that we all know something is happening, but we really don't have an understanding of what that something is today, let alone what that might look like in the short to medium term. So I have 6 distinguished experts here with me today. If I was to read you their bios, we would literally be here for the whole 90 minutes. So I am going to let them introduce themselves and give a little context of why they're sitting on the panel. So I'm going to hand over to Lindsay to start off with, and then we're just going to go down the line. Yes, microphone, please.
But just a quick intro or?
1 to 2 minutes, just who you are, where you're coming from, and kind of some context.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay? I'm Lindsay Freeman. I'm the director of the Technology Law and Policy Program at the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley School of Law. And my background is in criminal prosecution. I started my career at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office at a time where some of these initial AI uses like predictive policing and bail sentencing was starting to emerge, but that was over 10 years ago. So my domestic experience is a bit dated. For the last 10 years, I've really been focused on international criminal investigations. I was in the prosecutor's office of the International Criminal Court. And in my program at Berkeley, I have a team that works on international criminal investigations, primarily using OSINT and other digital techniques, and sort of doing some case building, which we share with various prosecutors who prosecute sort of Rome Statute crimes or mass atrocity crimes. So we are looking at AI both in terms of how we can use it in our own investigations, and my team experiments with that quite a bit. But we also increasingly have been looking at how perpetrators are using it to facilitate or enable their crimes. So I see it as understanding 2 sides of the coin, both positive uses and negative uses. And we've been doing some case building in armed conflicts where AI is currently being deployed. So those are the various connections to my current work.
Hi, good afternoon. Ashwini, Jarral. I'm here in a current role as an advisor to the IJUST Institute. IJUST Institute is a nonprofit that was actually started by U.S. Department of Justice in late 1990s for a simple reason to bring public and private sector together around innovation. And so right now, our role at IJUST is to stand up the International Center of Excellence for Justice and Public Safety and Security mission on artificial intelligence, where we're putting together a training and technical assistance program and also something called IJUST AI Labs, where our goal is to bring the innovation to this lab from public and private sector to test the solutions that are being implemented, plus looking at the efficacy of those solutions, including some of the ethical and responsible use, especially in our world. We have to be mindful of responsible use. And so we are putting this together, and Center of Excellence is in partnership with Miller Center on Policing and Resiliency out of Rutgers University, and also Professional Development Institute at University of Ottawa. These 2 universities are actually helping put a training program and also technical assistance. And my role is I'm leading that Center of Excellence development. As part of that Center of Excellence, we have also stood up a working group. So we ask if you are a practitioner or private sector, please come join the working group, because we have over 50 smart folks from public sector and private sector looking at some of the challenges, use cases around. So we just published our playbook on artificial intelligence, which I will talk about here shortly, where we have looked at all aspects. And of course, it's a living and breathing document playbook that we put together. So our goal is to put it out there in layman terms without a lot of technical lingo in there, how executives should be making decisions and implementing. And my background is I've been in this public safety and justice business for almost over 25 years. I have led national and international efforts around interoperability, starting with President Obama's initiative on developing an interoperability framework. I actually led that interoperability framework effort. with the Federal CIO Council, with support from Department of Justice, Defense, and Office of Director of National Intelligence. And we're proud to say we do have an interoperability framework that we strongly believe actually can play a key role in as we move forward with artificial intelligence. And I've been in the standards world, helped develop some of the standards around interoperability with some of the various standards organizations.
Hi, I'm Erik Luna. I'm Dai's colleague at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. My area of specialty is criminal law and criminal procedure. I was also a prosecutor in a California District Attorney's office in San Diego. I have spent most of my time, though, working either studying the criminal justice system, the domestic system, or from a comparative perspective, or working on policy changes with regards to the U.S. system. Most recently, I've been working on clemency issues at the federal level, and that, of course, has been an issue generally over the past, let's say, 6 months. So that's been an interesting area, and interestingly, artificial intelligence could touch not only that area, but I see a variety of places along the criminal justice spectrum, beginning with investigation all the way through pretrial processes. You may see it already in bail determinations. The big leap is when you start seeing it being used during trial process. And then, of course, I don't know if you followed, but there was someone who tried to deliver, I think it was an appellate court argument by artificial intelligence. I think that didn't turn out so well, but that's the beginning of a process of argumentation being done at a level, either at a research level or theoretically at a presentation level. So I look forward to participating.
Good to meet everyone. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Okay, fantastic. My name is Nema Milaninia. I am a partner at the law firm of King & Spalding, where I largely focus on defense and regulatory compliance for tech companies in emerging technologies, including AI. My background is a bit unique, I would say, in some ways, but it largely comprises of working on technology issues for the past 20 years. First at Wilson Sonsini, where I worked for about 6 years. I was subsequently a prosecutor at the International Criminal Court and the Yugoslav Tribunal for about 9 years. As the head of regulatory investigations at Google, where I worked on some of their most important AI investigations vis-a-vis the FTC, DOJ, but also externally. And then most recently, where I was a political appointee in the Biden-Harris administration, where I also worked on AI policy for the administration and the intersections with criminal accountability. It's lovely to meet you all, and I'm looking forward to this engaging conversation.
Hello? No. Now? Okay.
Yes.
Great. I'm Daniela Nogueira. I'm Chief Counsel to the Attorney General of New Jersey. In my role, I oversee an incredibly wide docket that covers legal, regulatory, and policy issues, but my special focus is on the intersection of law and technology, which has always been my special focus as long as I've been a lawyer, including when I was an intern at ACLU's SPT way back when.
Stanley with ACLU's SPT, just mentioned, Speech Privacy and Technology Project at the National Office. I've been with ACLU forever. I started 5 weeks before 9/11, and I am an emerging technologies specialist. And I cover a lot of new and emerging technologies where there isn't necessarily any litigation, but we still have the opportunity to influence the discourse, sometimes the formation of new technologies. As I have mainly encountered the criminal justice system and researched it through technologies that are used by law enforcement, such as drones, police body cameras. I was our police body cameras person, cameras, license plate readers, etc. I also look at AI as emerging technologies person, of course, and I look forward to a good conversation here.
Thank you. As you can see, we have some phenomenal expertise in this room that stretch a whole range in terms of experiences and sectors. How I would like to moderate this panel is I really like discussion as opposed to just one question, another person question. So I'm going to throw some pretty general questions, and I hope that we can actually play off and build on. So Daniela, I'm going to start with you. Can you share some of the examples of how AI is being used today in justice agencies? And then as people feel they want to jump in, please do.
Sure. So if you ask any attorney generals across the country, they'll tell you the states are the laboratories of democracy. That is certainly true in the AI context. I think states really learned from the privacy context that we can't leave it up for Congress to regulate or for industry to self-police. States have to do the research, build the tools, and pass the laws. So in New Jersey, Governor Murphy set up a AI task force in 2023 that came out with a number of recommendations. And some of those recommendations have helped inform how we're proceeding going forward. So for example, the state of New Jersey was the first state to do a comprehensive survey of its public employees and try to understand what they know about AI and what they anticipate to use it for going forward. And so using that, the information coming from public employees themselves, they've built an AI assistant tool for people all over the state in various capacities to use. They've built other types of tools for specific state agencies that are specific to those use cases. Most notably, probably for this audience, is our Division of Civil Rights has issued is the wrong word, launched a a civil rights innovation lab that is exploring different ways that technology can be used to help review, incidents of bias and complaints of bias and harassment, of discrimination, doing things like being able to review online advertisements for employment or housing for discrimination. So, New Jersey in particular is really focused on figuring out ways that AI can both help government be better, faster, more responsive to constituencies, and at the same time recognizing that there are pitfalls. And to that end, I'll say that like in New Jersey, it's really about it's a human-centered approach. So, the governor's office came out with a policy on state employees using AI, and there's a line in it that I really like that says, technology enables our work, but does not excuse our judgment. And I think that's really at the core of the human-centered approach and core to how New Jersey approaches the rollout of AI in government use. We have to really think about the humans at every step of the process. So who's building the tech, who's using the tech, how's the tech impacting humans? And that applies in so many different contexts, including the criminal justice context. But, when we think about the humans building the tech, one of the key recommendations, at least key for me, one of the key recommendations from the governor's AI task force report was whether we were having people from, historically underserved communities being part of the tech force, being part of the people who are building the tools for the state. And I think there are a lot of good questions around that.
Yeah, just to add on top of that, I think in the worlds that I've been on or in, the solution that you see AI playing is to resolve the issue of volume. I think the thing with the past decade is as the world has become more digital, as information has become more accessible, in fact, as information has become much more susceptible to users, including everyone in this room, being cultivated, that has created a problem of volume. There's more information out there with regards to any particular criminal event on the domestic front or on the international front, which on one level creates an opportunity, but mostly creates a challenge. A challenge from the standpoint of being able to evaluate all of that information and sussing out between what is relevant, irrelevant, or as I think is a growing problem, what is reliable and what is misinformation, disinformation, unreliable pieces of information, but also obviously drawing connectivity between all of those different and often varied pieces of information. And that's the space where ML and now AI has played, I think, a fairly transformative role and will play a fairly transformative role, but also one that is testing the boundaries of many institutions which have not cultivated staff and personnel to be able to proactively and effectively use those tools, or to create systems to audit their uses of those tools, or to create reliable mechanisms by which they otherwise use those tools. So for me, it's that system, the area of volume where we've seen this being more penetrative. And that can be anything from document review, that can be analyzing large swaths of telecom information together with large swaths of photos and videos to be able to just go through that information and identify figures of interest, to predictive analysis and linkage information.
Of the people who receive benefits from the state for disability and so forth were getting cut off, and the state agency would not tell them why. And apparently they had integrated a new system, computer system for evaluating who deserved to get aid and who didn't. And so a bunch of people were getting cut off. So there was transparency issues and so forth. It turned out that they were using a formula and a spreadsheet to evaluate, to use various variables to cut a bunch of people off. But a lot of the issues with quote unquote AI are the same as with a variable in a spreadsheet. And so, talking about the definition of AI, I think it stretches from a variable, and that's captured by the word algorithms. But ML, and you distinguish ML and AI being like transformers, but based architectures maybe is a CNN. But anyway, there are issues. I think the main new issue that the newer forms of AI, as opposed to a spreadsheet, bring in is the quality of the source data, maybe, and what hallucinations are, which are new with the transformer-based architectures. Yeah, but I just thought I'd set that out as level setting. We should think of it as like a spectrum from a spreadsheet formula all the way up to the newest frontier model.
All of them. Follow up on that. It seems that the Supreme Court has been both ahead of things and of course it's always behind. It changed this doctrine several years ago with regards to the Fourth Amendment. And it started to accept that there was a notion that technology could be used to do things that conceivably could be done, but just because the volume, if you didn't have technology, it would require dozens and dozens of law enforcement officers. It would be a resource issue. Volume equals resources. And that actually served historically as a kind of leavening force. It kept the law enforcement within bounds. They had to choose the cases that they would go after or would investigate. With the advent of technology that can go through lots of data or special types of data or find connections between the data, that is a game changer because it means that you do not have to have human bodies at $75,000 to $100,000 and underpaid, by the way. Law enforcement on the ground in cruisers, talking to people, following individuals. And instead it can be done by tracking their phones or tracking the GPS in their car, if that's enabled. And the Supreme Court recognized that this would change the doctrine in ways that all other changes have not, even things like the telephone. But they probably just did not fully appreciate what was coming down the pike unless they're very smart courts were preparing them with things that were just mentioned, and that the Fourth Amendment and other parts of the Constitution may not be prepared for.
If I may. So one of the things that we're looking is that, of course, volume, right? Resources, I think the speed at which we can transform information. So if you look at the justice life cycle, right? I'm going to use the word here, justice and public safety for a second. So think about a time when you get the first 911 call and you start your journey and interacting with public safety and justice, right? So what right now the uses are where call for service comes in, where AI is being used, and we have successfully seen this, of course, with the boundaries around it. The actual AI is listening in for the keywords, so resources can be dispatched while the human is actually analyzing the information, but at least the resources are. So we already testing that, and it's shown already success because of the staffing shortages, right? In the actual emergency communication centers on 911. The second piece is that also when that call comes in, it's in non-English, what do you do about it? today the scenario is, and it actually happened in Baltimore, where they had a contract with a company. The system goes down, they could not get, their call comes in, the person receiving the call did not know how to do the translation and interpretation. It's not just the translation, it's also the interpretation. Context matters. So what the line goes down, they could not get. So they had to bring resources from Johns Hopkins to actually do the translation. So now what we have done is that we have brought an AI translation and interpretation services that can actually do 120. So we have started, so that's one of the very successful use case when that call comes in, how you do the translation and interpretation, because translation is word to word, interpretation is what matters. So you can actually dispatch the resources. Now fast forward when you go to the law enforcement, policing community. So where we have already seen, of course, everybody knows a lot of buzz around the incident writing issues. But there are other use cases that we have already tested and have worked. We talked about body worn camera. But right now AI is being used is object recognition. Yes, we can talk and have a lot of conversation around use of facial recognition, but it is being used there. So AI has shown some successes there, but again, with a human validation, human in the loop concept that we're going to talk here later. So we have seen some of the use cases, object recognition, informing the officer, giving them some information so they can make a smart decision. And as we start our journey going to the courts, one of the big things that we have looked at where the courts are struggling is that the document processing, the actual introduction of chatbots to even take some of the complaints and a lot of those things. So we've seen the document analysis, preparing of some of the reports, but of course it has to be reviewed. And then the big thing that we're seeing now with the shortage of clerks in the courts, how AI can actually fill that gap or doing that transcription. Some courts are already testing that use case. When we go to corrections, we're looking right now in corrections, risk and needs assessment based houseman placing. What that means, if somebody gets incarcerated and walks into jail or prison, if they are a member of a gang, and now there's another gang member in the same facility, how we can use this, because today officers have to use their knowledge, use their data they have in front of. So that's where AI is being used, looking at the risk and needs, and also doing a placements in the different cells or different units in jails and prisons. And then same thing with community corrections. Risk and needs is the big thing. So right now, there is organizations who are testing risk and needs in the corrections. And then the big thing is when somebody comes back into the community having their mental health issue, substance use disorder issue. So we're actually looking at how AI can actually help, not just with the risk and needs, but focusing on the needs and what services they need. If somebody has a condition of release, they do not show up for their appointment. They're not getting their medication. They're not doing their counseling. So how we actually let the probation officer know. So that's where AI. So these are some of the use cases that we are seeing right now across the justice and public safety lifecycle.
Sure. Well, in the examples we've had so far of sort of these mass introductions into different systems of AI, some of the sort of concerns have emerged, dealing with the volume of data, the reliability of the training data, or biases that are put into that and building the algorithm. Hallucinations were mentioned, and people have said in these various applications the importance of having the human in the loop. But one thing I think is a bit underappreciated or under-discussed is how these technologies and their introduction actually is changing how humans behave and think. If you look at the introduction of some technologies, just like the maps we have on our phone to guide us, you see with younger generations, they're very bad at finding their own way in directions because they've grown up so reliant on the maps. If they get lost, they can't find their way back. And there have been studies on that. And my big concern with AI and some of the introductions is that it's taking away people's critical thinking. And in open source investigations or investigative work, critical thinking is the key thing in all of this, in any kind of analysis as a human. And in our human relationships, humans question other humans. They don't necessarily take it on good faith unless it's somebody and you trust. But we are seeing in preliminary studies of this sort of over trust in the technology, a lack of questioning it. So I think that's an important thing to focus on as well as we're studying impact of technology, is also impact and changes on the humans using it.
Yeah, on that point, this is definitely a concern for the state. You know, there's a recent Salesforce report that says 6 out of 10 IT professionals in government don't have AI training. 6 out of 10 in government, right? So what the other side of the coin of the human in the loop approach is, are we training people to understand the limits of AI? Are we training people to understand the pitfalls so that they can understand AI as a tool that they can use, but also be cognizant of how it's not a perfect tool? An analogy I like to make is driving. So a car is a really powerful machine. And even though that technology is pretty old, it's been around a really long time now, we still require everyone to train to use a car and to get a license to use a car before we can let them out on public roadways. And I think that the piece on training people to use AI is going to be really key, and it's going to be really key forever. The same way that, you know, you need to figure out how to operate something as powerful as a car.
I would just make two comments. Yeah, and AI, especially large language models like ChatGPT, LLMs, they make errors in different ways than humans make errors. So they're less intuitive to us. We don't evaluate them as well. Our errors tend to be clustered. If you start asking me about theoretical physics, I will be wrong, you know, about all of it, or you can tell that I'm BSing my way through the answer. Whereas an LLM will be confidently correct about all of it and then utterly wrong suddenly and unpredictably about one area. And then in terms of, there was been discussion about sort of the volume, and this is something that we've paid a lot of attention to, because one of the things that a lot of technologies do is that they allow the scaling up of activities that used to be expensive and human and manual, such as surveillance. You know, tailing somebody in a car for 28 days, as in the US Supreme Court Jones case, used to take a whole crew of police officers, and now you just put something on the car. And when that happens, I think that a lot of, as you're saying, I think that a lot of the role that AI will be playing will allow things to be scaled up that previously couldn't be scaled up. And then you talk about a human in the loop, but humans are lazy, and they are not going to watch it closely over time. And so there's a real danger. And the other thing that happens is when things become cheaper, they not only get done more, they get overdone often. And so we see that there are illegitimately broad uses of a lot of these technologies, where before there was a natural limit imposed by the expense. You see this, for example, drones. A police helicopter costs $6 million. You have to have a ground crew and pilots. And so a drone can cost like $2,000, and you can have a whole suite of them and over the city all the time. And obviously the same thing is true with location tracking and so forth. But, and one of the papers that I've written and one of the issues I've looked at a lot is video analytics. Basically video footage is something that we've seen huge oceans of video footage, which are important in the criminal justice system, created, but it's was very, very expensive, unlike a text search, to scrutinize and search video footage. That is no longer true because of machine vision. And in some ways, all the video cameras that are all around of our cities and everything are in some senses going to be waking up and are no longer going to be dumbly recording, but will be using AI to actively decide, is this person suspicious? Is that person suspicious? Why are they walking this way when everybody else is walking that way? That's an anomaly. I'm going to call in a guard, and so forth. And so this has an enormous potential to create big chilling effects in our society, because we don't feel watched when we see a camera now, because we know that nobody's going to look at it, but somebody will be looking at it, and that will be an AI. Insufficiently governed by a human in the loop, because the scale will go up and humans are lazy and they won't be looking at everything, and they'll have too much trust in the system. These are all pretty predictable problems, I think.
I agree with everything was said. The great discussion. Let me add in just one example of some good that'll come potentially through artificial intelligence. We already see it in Phoenix, which is in that city, it's Waymo, which is driving around with not having to drive. And as somebody who studies not just criminal justice in technology, but generally the criminal justice system and issues like what is the major areas of crime commission? Where is it most likely for somebody to get hurt or killed? Drinking and driving.
Mm-hmm.
And on that one area, I welcome our new artificial intelligence overlords, in terms of taking away the most dangerous part of human activity on a daily basis. But that's just one example, and that does not offset everything else. That's just an example where the criminal justice system, if you were thinking about the system as it currently exists and ways that big volumes of cases could be removed, there's one.
We will have questions in a little bit, so just hold. So with all of your answers, I've been hearing things like capacity, knowledge, interoperability, and trust. And to me, when we think about how much is known about AI today in the general workplace, there's not a lot. So how do we have to start thinking about the education, the training, and both people who are out in the workforce in the criminal justice system, but also potentially our next generation of law students or criminal justice students? And Lindsay, I might start with you.
Sure. Well, I think playing with and experimenting with these technologies is a really important way to understand how they work. You know, at a lot of universities, they're banning the use of them. And obviously, for writing papers, for doing your own work, that's a very important part of university education. And for that purpose, that makes sense. But I think right now having people experiment with the different ways they work and also sort of comparing it to sort of human research. You know, one of the things I do on my team just with human analysts and investigators, since I'm a lawyer, is I cross-examine them. You know, when they come to me with certain findings, I ask questions about how did you find that? How did you get there? What was your source? And with some of these AI models, you can do that to a certain degree, and that's one we've been experimenting with different ones when you sort of question it and probe it back to see where they're getting their information. This doesn't quite answer your question, but one of the other issues raised in sort of the large scale application in policing and in the corporate world is the proprietary nature of some of the algorithms and technologies where you can't probe it and it's more of a black box. That's an issue. But in terms of overall education, though, I think you need to break out of the universities. Like with the students I see, I feel pretty good about their ability to use and experiment with this because they're already adopting it and working it into the world. And in a lot of universities, professors are addressing the use of AI. I think the concern is the adult population and the greater population of people who haven't grown up with this. I think the question is, how do we get that education out there? How do we integrate that? I mean, certainly in the workplace, they should be dedicated to ongoing training and learning videos and other different things, but I'm also curious to hear other people's suggestions about how you go about doing that.
So I think from the workforce development, we have to actually break this into 3 layers. First is the executives, people who are making the decision to bring this capability or capacity into their organization. Quite often, if you have a police chief or a judge or correction secretary or a sheriff, they go to a conference, they see a shiny object, they see a cool technology and come back and say, I want this now, and let's implement it. They don't ask all the questions. So I think it's very important that we need to start educating the executives how to ask the right questions to make the smart investment to reduce the risk and liability later on. We have learned this from facial recognition. We have learned this from body-worn camera, and we can go on and on. We cannot keep making the same mistakes. So it's very important that we actually put an actual training program for the executives to understand what they're getting into and what they're getting their organizations into, and asking the right question before they make an investment to bring that capacity. Second is what we call the operational level. It has to be use case driven. We cannot just take a same use case and keep training everybody because if we have seen this, where we take a law enforcement use case to the court's audience, they'll be lost because that use case does not apply to them. So half of them are not even paying attention. So we have to actually have a use case driven training when it comes to AI or anything else. So as we say, if you don't see yourself in the movie, you're going to lose interest in that movie, right? So they have to see themselves. So we have to develop the operational use case based training program for the operators who are doing the grunt work. Then the last is the technologists, right? So the people who are in the workforce now or the next generation, we have to involve them in actually building some of this capacity and capability. We just cannot say, hey, this is how we have done it for 100 years, and this is how our technology needs to be responsive. And that is where we're seeing a lot of challenges, where they always butt heads because they are not thinking about the future. They're thinking about how they have traditionally done. And AI is actually pushing our limits to say, you have to rethink your operations. You have to rethink about how you're doing. So we have to actually, when we're building these models and we're training these models, not only we have to bring the existing workforce and the technologies into this, we have to bring others, and across all three layers, executive operators and the technologists, we need to ask and challenge everything that we do from using this capability. If we don't challenge, we don't ask the question and blindly say, hey, we trust this is the greatest technology because we saw a success story. Because everybody talks about the success story and it becomes a front page news also. But if there's a one bad story, because you did not think about it, it's going to be a front page news too. So we have to think about all of these. And right now we're actually, just as an example, in New Jersey, I just finished a call last week. We're launching a workforce development seminar series for law enforcement, where we're literally taking 4 plays out of our playbook and talking about ethical use, responsible use, and governance as the first 4 tracks in making investment in AI in law enforcement for New Jersey public safety professions.
Daniela, do you want to comment on that as well?
We have a very active Office of Innovation that is working with private sector partners, academic partners, stakeholders across various industries on building out training modules for various use cases. There's the most basic one we have in New Jersey has already, last year had already been, already trained 9,000 state employees. So it must be much more than that by now. And the only other thing I wanted to add is, we are also developing school curricula. There's pilot programs that are going to be starting in public schools in the state of New Jersey, because if you want to have that workforce development, that educated workforce, it's got to be built in early.
I think Jay and Eric both wanted to jump in
Just
as
going to
well.
say, I mean, in terms of training people on how to evaluate these systems, I think that people should be taught that these systems can hallucinate, can be completely wrong in the data that they put out, and they can be racist as hell. And if you assume that that the system may put out false data and may be deeply racist, what are the consequences of using it in a particular use case? There are some use cases where if it makes terrible errors, it doesn't matter that much. Sometimes I use the LLMs to ask me, what's the argument of this book? And if the LLM makes something up and it's actually some different book, but it's still a really interesting argument, it's still valuable to me, even if you have to be careful if I attribute it later, but that I have to back up. But there are cases where it doesn't matter if it's wrong factually about stuff. But you don't want to do human experimentation. There are things that really affect people's lives. And so the first question that anybody who's thinking about deploying these things ask is, what's the consequences if it's the worst possible version of an LLM?
Eric, I think you wanted to jump in as well.
I in agreement. Recently, I don't know what billionaire said that it's going to be only 2 professions left eventually. And of course, lawyers are going to, he has them on the dinosaur track. And that may be true for many things that are in law. But I actually think that everything that was said, particularly the last comments, is a good reason for well-trained lawyers who are trained in skepticism, not cynicism, but skepticism. And that's what good lawyers do. They're skeptical. I'll just give you an example, my own use of artificial intelligence. I've used several of the ones that are available where you have to pay some modest fee to use. And I've used it sometimes for areas that I know a lot about. And sometimes it'll come up and it will hit that area perfectly, or it's maybe not a hallucination, it's just off. And my spider tingles, my BS signals go out and I go, this is wrong. And I can tell that. And that's because I was trained as a lawyer at a good law school, and I teach at a good law school, and I'm around good lawyers and good law professors. So I think it's actually, it's an argument that there may be a human element involved, some human agency involved, certainly in the short term and the midterm, long term, but in terms of keeping some tabs on this and also checking some kind of some human rationality and not just machine rationality.
So what I'm hearing from each of you is trust is very important here. Yet I would argue there's probably not a lot of trust in the criminal justice system in the United States. I'm an Australian, I get to say that. They can revoke my green card, I guess. But maybe starting with Nema, how do you then build trust around a technology that already had a lot of concern, especially as we've already heard about the discrimination, the bias going in with the training data?
So it's a good question. I don't know how you build trust. Listen, I think taking a step back, I think the key issue here is understanding risks and how do you develop systems to mitigate those risks, right? Fundamentally, that is what you think about when you try to construct a compliance program at a company, in government. That is what regulators think about when they're trying to construct regimes to be able to legislate and deal with emerging technologies. We've seen the EU, for instance, think through its own regulatory scheme as it relates to AI by defining it around risk and then layering on top of it expectations of what a compliance program should look like. And I think through that, the aim is to not so much develop trust, but to mitigate the risks that, you know, systems that are very powerful, like AI, can have in terms of the consequences. And I think the criminal justice system is a highly important example as to why AI, if deployed too hastily, or if there's not sufficient protections around it, can have genuinely problematic and damaging consequences, obviously on an individual level, because of how susceptible they are to biases. Because they are, right? At the end of the day, if you think about the life cycle of any AI model, right? It begins with, first, what is the purpose of this model? Well, right now, we already have AI models that think through critical decisions, such as like, should this person receive bail? Should this person be released on parole early, right? Then think through data collection, right? What is the data collection for the criminal, like the convicted population in the United States going to resemble? And how is that going to influence the output of any model that's therefore designed to adjudicate between what are the characteristics of a person who's most likely to commit a crime versus someone who is not, both from the investigative standpoint, then obviously to the prosecutorial standpoint, and then subsequently, obviously, to sentencing, and then post-sentencing determinations. Those are incredibly consequential decisions that are different from the consequences at a civil level, where they might be different. The only way to build trust in a model that makes those determinations is by being very risk adverse, not deploying models unless you're assured that you know the consequences, the risks, and have built controls around it. It's the same thing with the deployment of autonomous weapons, right? Where there's lives that are at stake if you make a mistake at the design phase, or the auditing phase, or at the deployment stage. And we've seen that already. So from my standpoint, that's what's necessary. Now, we are in this unusual circumstance where in most places we don't have regulatory schemes that decide how AI models should be cultivated and deployed, either at the state level, certainly not the federal level, and then you have it at kind of more international level. They don't exist, or if they do exist, they're highly fragmented. So you see a lot of regulation by litigation right now with the Federal Trade Commission, various state attorney generals, international enforcement bodies trying to get involved because they understand the risks that are at play. You see civil cases by plaintiffs who say I've been wrongfully damaged as a result of the deployment of AI, including in the criminal law context, bringing suit. So really, the effort right now is how do you fill in that gap in order to develop a space where people feel comfortable that we're not in the wild, wild west in terms of deploying new technologies, but rather there's some sensibility behind them to ensure that the consequences, which are very real, are being accounted for and addressed appropriately.
I don't know if maybe the two things they're actually at loggerheads. If you talk about trust.
You might need to move your microphone. People offline.
Sorry, I
Thank you.
forget that there are people in our at-home audience. when you think about the scholarship on trust and legitimacy, a guy named a professor named Tom Tyler has written extensively on this. And he found that trust is built through a variety of ways, but procedural justice is a key aspect. And there are aspects of procedural justice, the things that you know about notice, opportunity to be heard, those kinds of things. Well, artificial intelligence jumps over that. And so there's a problem, is you have humans, you're trying to build human trust in technology that oftentimes skips through the steps that are the ways in which human trust are built. Now, maybe I'm wrong on that, but that is, I can see it myself and how trustworthy I am with technology as a child of the 80s. And my father, who's even more skeptical of it. And you can imagine that you're trying to build trust in these devices or this technology, and they're skipping over steps that historically are the way that you build trust.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
So I think from my perspective, I think yes, trust is a very loaded term. Like ethical and responsible use, you will see those three in AI, left and right. I think we have to define what it means to be trusted in criminal justice. And criminal justice is driven by community stakeholders. We have to get the community engaged, identify the stakeholders, and define the definition of trust first, right? Like we were talking about procedural justice. I think what we have to do is that once we have the community engagement, and we need to be open about it because we're having this conversation, we're actually doing a survey right now. And to my surprise, 90% of the organizations that we're surveying, they don't even have a basic policies because they're jumping the gun and using AI, and the stakeholders who will be consumer or the provider of these capabilities are not even engaged in this conversation. So we have to have that upfront conversation of the stakeholder engagement, putting a separate governance model or whatever we want to call it, that there's some checks and balances, because the biggest issue we have AI in general right now, there are a lot of discussions around the globe around standards and compliance, but nobody has figured out what that really means. If you just Google AI risk compliance and tell me what you get, you're going to get a basic risk matrix. So this is something that we have to define is what it means for risk and liability for criminal justice community. So we have compliance defined for criminal justice, what the guardrails are, and we should actually have a third-party validations on these uses, which usually does not happen. And we need to build the confidence and trust. We need to have those third-party validations on regular basis because AI is also changing on minute-by-minute basis. So what you implement now might not be accurate later, an hour later. So we have to build some compliance and validations built in through the life cycle.
Awesome. I can tell you, Jay is burning to give an
I
answer.
just want to make a quick point, which is I 100% agree with you all saying about the need for checks and balances and to do this right and everything. But my experience over 20 years of new technologies flowing through law enforcement is that they tend to be deployed before they're ready for prime time, when they're half baked still, like LLMs are now in some ways, at least that may always be, I don't know. And number two, are deployed very sloppily. For example, we see this in face recognition. All the police departments, they say this should be used for investigative leads only, which in theory is like, maybe okay, I don't know, but then, they arrest people based on a match, based on a fuzzy cell phone picture, or they send a picture to a key witness and with the top result from the face recognition and say, is this the guy? Which, if anybody knows anything about the malleability of witness memory, would find outrageous. And so, I hear these conversations. I'm just observing that, I'm very pessimistic about how these things are going to be deployed. I think there's a lot of potential for trouble.
And I was just going to add that from my perspective, it really depends on the audience we're talking about, right? When I'm talking about the general public accessing AI tools, what I'm hoping is that we're cultivating mistrust rather than the opposite. When I'm thinking about government using AI tools to improve services for the general public, then I don't think in terms of trust. How do I get government employees to trust this product? It's more that I think about how do I get the AI tool to prove to me that it is trustworthy? Like it has to show its work. It has to, give sources for its reasoning. And then we can, of course, as everyone here has talked about, build in the checks and balances. When I worked at the World Bank, we worked on building programs for foreign governments around the world. And a big thing is there an appeals process for the automated decision? like building in that step where you just have that as of right. If you are facing the consequences of an automated decision-making platform, then that allows for some of these procedural rights to be able to be exercised.
So I've had the pleasure of asking questions for the last 50 minutes, and it's hard to believe that's 50 minutes already taken up. And so we have 25 minutes left. And I know we have at least one question from the floor. So I'd like to open up to the audience, and I will kind of point at you. And if you would like to say who you are and where you're from before you pose a question, that would be wonderful.
I'm Lily Meyer. I'm a undergraduate junior majoring in criminology and criminal justice, but I'm currently in DC as a junior fellow for the Leadership Diplomacy and National Security Lab here at ASU. And I guess I was just curious, I'm not sure if you can answer this question, but you talked a lot about like law enforcement, judicial, and other CRJ like officials' use of AI. But like how about offender use of AI? For example, like in the cyber truck bomb in Las Vegas, the offender was asked ChatGPT, how do I initiate this attack? So I was wondering if you guys have just any comments about how you would respond to that. Is there an AI system or algorithm that you can create to help feed out like a offender or like misuse of AI, or just like any comments or perspectives about that?
I think he's ready to go.
Well, it's a very good question. And I think with any new technology, actually criminals tend to be the ones who use it first and are the most innovative, and police and law enforcement are catching up. It is this constant cat and mouse game, and this is no different. So I think as well as law enforcement trying to use these tools for their own purposes, they have to also just be putting time to understand what are the criminal uses of it? What are the malicious uses of it? I think the tempo of things are going to speed up on both sides with certain kind of crime, cyber attacks using AI for assistance is going to speed that up, and law enforcement is going to need to be able to use these technologies well to keep up with it. But I think it's a real concern. I mean, the lack of regulation on these types of models and when they get introduced. And to Jay's point, one thing I sort of wanted to follow up on the fact that AI gets introduced in sort of the beta test stage and before it's ready. It's not like giving you a car that's been built. It's like building the car around you. I think people need to understand that this is different than other types of technologies when it's constantly evolving, and it's one you have to engage with to be able to understand it. You can't just read a bunch of articles on how AI works and think you understand how AI works. Like, you have to actually get hands-on, play with the different models, see the differences between the various ones that have been out and how they work. I think that will make us all more informed. But yeah, I think that's one argument, is that the criminals are going to use this no matter what, which is why we shouldn't necessarily resist introducing them to law enforcement. We should just do it very, very carefully with proper regulation and safeguards and all of that on top of it.
A quick side on it, because I agree with that. It's dated. An article that I wrote with Joshua Fairfield, who's a professor at Washington University, called Digital Innocence in the Cornell Law Review. This was based on a kind of looking at the wrongful conviction phenomenon and the possibility that this could be proven using digital evidence. Everything would have to be that I put in there is probably procedurally correct. You just have to add in artificial intelligence as a potential tool to be used. And I don't see why it couldn't and shouldn't be used in a system, an adversarial system, where there's supposed to be equality of arms from both sides.
Jay, I can see you're wanting to jump in.
Led like 300 years of religious wars and all kinds of trouble. I think we're going to see all kinds of trouble coming from LLMs, but I think also nobody's gonna want to go back. When you said perpetrators use, I'm working for the ACLU, so I changed that to alleged perpetrators. And I think there will be privacy issues around the use of LLMs. And I think that I saw one think tank propose that the big companies screen everybody's queries and send them suspicious ones to law enforcement. We would be against that. I think that you will see a lot of private uses of LLMs because they're getting small enough that you can run them locally now, so that you have absolute privacy. You run it on your own machine. You can run a GPT-4 level LLM now on your own machine. And my third point is, a colleague of mine at the ACLU, along with some academics, wrote a piece. It was a model based on the AI models for figuring out who should get bail, but instead of judging the risk of the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator to society, it judged the risk of the criminal justice system to the accused. How likely is this person who's been accused of a crime, who's been arrested, but not convicted, how likely are they, for example, to get a super long sentence that's way longer than most sentences that people who commit an equivalent crime get? And so they use machine learning to predict like the risk to the individual from an unjust criminal justice system. So I think that's an example of what you're talking about, which is that AI is used in inevitably will use creative ways on both sides of the adversarial system.
Other questions? Please. Could you just introduce yourself, please?
Oh, sure. Thanks. Hi, my name is Charlie Germano. I'm a cyber and privacy lawyer here in DC. And before that, I was a technologist and head of cybersecurity at a local NGO. But we've talked a lot about the opportunities and risks of AI generally. I'm curious to hear from any or all of you if there's any jurisdiction that you think is getting it right, state, country, region, anything. Who's doing this well?
I'm not going to answer the question specifically. I think the one thing to know about the jurisdictions is that it's very fragmented, right? So there's no, as I mentioned, there's no federal legislation on AI. This president has announced his own EO to express guidance from various departments and agencies to also come up with rules and regulations concerning AI. The Department of Commerce just came out with 2 papers through NIST. At the state level, you have Colorado that passed an expansive AI bill. You have Virginia that had a bill that passed with the legislature but got vetoed by the governor. You have California that's thinking about it. You had actually just last year alone 600 different pieces of legislation going through different states on AI, the vast majority of which are in the process. And you have what's going on internationally, obviously, with the EU AI Act having just come to pass this year, come into effect this year, but in increments. And then, frankly, what's going on in the rest of the world. So I think the landscape, for better and for worse, depending on how you view that, is deeply, deeply fragmented. And in terms of who's doing it better and who's doing it worse, it's hard to say, right? Because it fundamentally comes down to what is the benchmark by which you're judging these regulations, right? We are in a circumstance where the race on AI is very deeply intersected with the race in terms of national security and the concerns with regards to national security, especially vis-a-vis China, where they have invested significant amounts of money into their own AI companies. And now you have in the EU similar motives and similar comments by President Macron, the chancellor in Germany, who have said, listen, we have always been the bastion for regulation as it relates to new tech, but we also need to be the bastion for new innovation, especially as it relates to AI, because this isn't like any other technology. This is a game changer with regards to not only how we function on a political level, but in terms of our national security interests. So that element of this has created this tension between this desire to legislate and create the controls that we all think are sensible and needed, especially in the spaces that we've discussed, such as criminal law, with not prohibiting innovation such that it would create a disadvantage vis-a-vis various countries, including for military usage, but obviously for non-military usage as well. So, that I did a very lawyerly thing by not answering your question. But I just want to, I think contextualizing it is quite important because because it's not an easy question to answer given the way we've seen things manifest.
From the state's perspective, I will say that every state that I talk to is very focused on what their regulatory regime is going to look like for AI. They're especially concerned because, you know, they waited for decades for Congress to pass a privacy law. Congress never passed a privacy law. And so then we start getting the state by state approach in the privacy context. And they're not going to wait around for that same process to play out with AI. That being said, I want to say that from, you know, I have to review draft state legislation and other related things. And, you know, the United States presents a unique hurdle, which is the First Amendment. And I'm a former First Amendment lawyer. I love the First Amendment. But I think it's actually part of why it's been slower in the states than I anticipate, given the frenetic energy that is around the AI legal landscape in the states. You know, when we talk about whether an AI, a lot of these large language models already have built in that they're not going to teach you how to make a bomb. Like they have privacy, they have policies built into their model where they just won't answer that type of question, right? But could I pass a law that says they can't tell someone how to build a bomb? That's a First Amendment problem, right? So there are a lot of complicated competing rights that we have to navigate in order to build a good regulatory regime.
A couple of examples that I can share is that National Capital Region, there's a group of emergency communication centers that are actually working together to develop a policy, and they're using small examples of developing the AI capability to test it. And what they're doing is they're also not just developing in their own agency, they're actually working with high school students. So they're using high school students as their backup workforce. So like, for example, Fairfax County, Prince William, they're actually working with their school systems to actually work with them. So they're actually small use cases. One of the use cases that came to our attention, we just hosted in December a leadership summit of corrections executives. Georgia Department of Corrections has a great success story of how some of the illegal enterprises were smuggling some of the contrabands, drugs and others using drones, and where they have now showcased actual use of AI in a very small scenario where they had some intel and how they actually use AI to build that capacity to basically put an end to that. So they're very small use cases, but again, those are still need to be validated with others, because if something works in one jurisdiction, doesn't mean it's going to work in another.
Lindsay, would you like to jump in, given your work at the international level?
On the who's getting it right.
Yeah, especially from the human rights dimension.
I don't have a great answer for that because it is a very, very hard question. And I think we still need to see, you know, we still need to watch because we don't know sort of long-term harms, unanticipated or secondary consequences of the introduction of these technologies. Yeah, I'm trying to think if you know some other sort of specific state examples, but none are coming to mind right now.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot, sorry. We have time for 2 more questions. Yes, please.
Hi, Jay Ricayes. I'm an engineer here in DC. I was just curious about, like, is there actually robust, I don't know, innovative spaces that are bringing in engineers, scientists to collaboratively work with criminal justice offices? I mean, intentionally. I mean, to my grad work or fundamental research, because it seems like I think there's a lot of great uses where consumers are using AI technologies to build a lot of comedy, satire, and really predictions and simulations before crimes happen based off of previous bad situations. So I'm surprised we're not recruiting, I think, faster or creatively when it comes to who helps build these technologies.
Yeah, it's a good question. If I can tackle it at different layers. And I think the answer is yes and no, because I think there are certain layers of, if you want to think about it like the law enforcement structure where that's happening, and then other layers where it's not. So to give you an example, in cases that I've worked on, the Department of Justice will bring in someone with a technical background. And I'm talking about AI cases, right? Who is well-versed in terms of not just the technology, but also an understanding as to kind of the specifics with regards to what to watch out for in terms of modeling. I've seen state AGs, attorney generals at the state level, equally do the same thing. The Federal Trade Commission has a chief technologist who has a technical background that informs, and she has a team with her, that informs their investigations. In the US, in the federal government, beyond the FTC, right, there was a concerted effort in the last administration to bring in folks with technical backgrounds at the diplomatic level in the State Department, the National Security Council, obviously in terms of framing policy, but also in the FBI as well, obviously for purposes of law enforcement. So you have seen this growing immersion of folks with technical backgrounds being brought in to law enforcement bodies or regulators to better inform. And that's obviously a very good thing, right? It's a good thing because I think one of the biggest mistakes as lawyers we often make is by thinking we understand technical issues or that we can be engineers when that's obviously not the case, right? And I say this because now I'm going to take a look at where I don't think this is happening. So like my former employers, the International Criminal Court, for instance, or the Yugoslav Tribunal, you don't see the same concerted effort in terms of bringing in folks with technical skills. And in fact, not only is that a disservice to the institution writ large, but it's caused them to rely upon other organizations which equally don't have folks with technical skills that have embedded within them. You know, my background has been, like, as I mentioned, I've worked in the private sector at Google. I've at a firm, obviously, I work with these companies as well. I've worked in government and I've worked at these institutions. The brilliance of engineers that we had at Google and their ability to actually look at things and understand things from a technical standpoint and unpack them cannot be neglected. I mean, these are genuinely bright folks. And I've seen the government, our government, do a good job in terms of bringing that talent in, because the incentives there of doing good, of helping, for instance, curtailing technologies which might be abused, has motivated folks to come into government. And those motivations, whatever administration you believe in, whatever your politics are important, because that's how you get talent to take government service and not take a high income and going into the private sector. In the international space, that hasn't happened yet, to a disservice to that space and given the needs there. And in terms of other countries, they're beginning to pick up the pace. I've spoken with prosecutors in France, in Spain, in the UK, and they're now increasingly beginning to embed folks with technical backgrounds into their law enforcement investigative capacities, but they haven't done as much as we have, in fact, in this country so far to that extent. I hope that answers your question.
Let's see, please.
One add on that is, I think it's important to have the information and the relationship going both ways. One thing in the broader field of new and emerging technologies you see a lot of is tech solutionism, of people who have technologies and want to push it on, you know, any kind of application they can find for it. And at the Berkeley Human Rights Center, we do investigations, and lots of people are coming to us with technology to use. And a lot of the technology is built without having that use case or knowing the real problems in other fields. And so we've been trying to do really two-way information sharing, where I'll have people from the information school come in and sit in our meetings, and we'll talk about our problems sort of over a long period of time of these are the different issues to deal with. And I mean, one of the projects we've started working on is identifying mass graves based on earth disturbances and satellite imagery, and using AI for that. But that kind of came from somebody talking about what they were working on in use of satellite imagery and synthetic aperture radar, us having a problem of trying to identify other mass graves and kind of coming to that together. So I do think in order for, especially for the International Criminal Court and other international tribunals, they also just have to do a much better job because there isn't a commercial market for it, the way there is for national policing, of going to people who are working in technology and saying, this is what's important to us. These are the challenges we're having. Because I do find once you start having those conversations, there's a lot of technical people who want to help with human rights and investigating mass atrocities. Like lots of people want to get involved, but there's not enough of us going out there and sort of describing specifically what the problems we're having are and what would speed up and assist our work.
There's an article that I used to have printed out and up on my wall in my office. It's from, I don't know, 15 years ago. I think it was in Foreign Policy magazine, and it was about, I think it was in Kenya. They had really high amount of traffic accidents. They were trying to figure out how to reduce traffic fatalities. And they tried all these newfangled technological initiatives, and then tried one thing at the end of the day where they put a sticker in bus windows or in like these kind of vans that operate as essentially buses that said, driving too fast, like ask your driver to slow down. And within a year, they had reduced traffic fatalities by 60%. And I had that up in my office for years because I don't want to get away from the fact that you're trying to solve problems. When you're innovating, you're not trying to create products in search of a problem to solve, right? And so you have to be thinking really hard about what it is am I trying to solve. In the traffic fatality context, you're trying to change behavior across an entire city, an entire state, entire country, right? When I think about government using technology, and especially in my enforcement and litigation work, I'm thinking about the fact that bad actors are using technology, and I need to understand what they're doing. So I need people with technological expertise to come in and explain to me how we're going to find out what's happening here, whether we're investigating, a broker dealer or a massive social media company. Like, I need the technological expertise because I'm fighting something that has a lot of tech power behind it. But if I'm trying, but it's always, you got to have that fit. And I try to remember that maybe sometimes a sticker in a window is a better solution than, deploying AI for something.
Money off that.
So we have time for one short question. I know we only have time for that because I can see the wine being poured into the wine glasses. So I know that's a good sign as anything to say that we're at time. So please.
Sure. So this has been very interesting. So thank you all. I will say, as I've been sitting here, I've not felt great about just the use of AI in the criminal legal system in general. And I understand, however, that it's already being used and we can't be Luddites, and we have to really just be willing to engage with where the world is going. However, I just was wondering if you all could maybe speak to how would someone who is perhaps in the business of defending people who are people who have allegedly committed crimes, because I feel as though the conversation tends to often orient around the prosecutorial element or the enforcement element of artificial intelligence, which I often feel as though I don't really hear about how the other side of the adversarial relationship is looking to utilize artificial intelligence, if at all, and where they kind of come into this conversation. Because I just kind of feel like it's just giving a future of surveillance, which is, we're already there. But I don't know. I guess I'm kind of just wondering are we missing anything, and how do we balance that harm with the possible reality that's just going to happen?
So we can't be Luddites. That's fine. We can be boring. Because the applications, I think, in the criminal defense context, that are probably the most useful are the most boring ones. You know, when your client's been sitting in jail because he hasn't or she hasn't gotten bail, because discovery in the case, just because the massive information, it normally would take 3 years for you to review, but because you have a tool that's available for you that would allow you to actually synthesize that information in the course of a month and get to trial faster, that's immediately something that's amazing for him or her, right? When you're a federal public defender who has thousands of cases on their docket, and you have a motion that is quite kind of pro forma that you would normally spend an hour just drafting. But what you can do is take examples of similar types of motions you've done in the past, pop it into, let's say, Notebook LLM, and then it produces a draft motion for you relevant for the specific circumstances based on that within the span of a minute. And then you just have to review it, analyze it for purposes of whether it makes sense, and reduce the time that you've spent on it. That's obviously massive. When you might miss something on LexisNexis or Westlaw, but by virtue of kind of an enhanced search function that is powered by AI, it picks that case that you might not have been able to identify when you're researching at 1 a.m. in the morning because you're so overworked. It helps you there, right? When you can run searches and identify exculpatory information on images or videos, which can be massive in terms of quantity, but also obviously in terms of the amount of data by virtue of both audio recognition or visual recognition technology, that obviously is a huge service to your client. So I think in these ways, right, there's massive use cases, and in the kind of the private firm environment, our clients have now come to the point where they expect us to use AI for building efficiencies for cost reasons, but also to make sure we're not missing anything, right? Because they see the value of it to second guess ourselves, to build in efficiencies in order to test our assumptions on a matter, to be able to kind of look around the corner on things and make sure that there's no hole that's missed in terms of being able to defend them appropriately or to investigate as appropriate as well. I can only imagine that that's a circumstance where any public defender and any defendant would benefit greatly in terms of the uses of AI. Now, there's access to those tools. That is something we have to resolve so that there's not disparity between the haves and have-nots, as has always been the case whenever it comes to new technologies, so that a federal public defender has licenses to use tools that a prosecutor or well-compensated firm has access to, right? Those are things we'll have to think through, but the benefits in terms of defense cases are there, in terms of not just saving lives, but minimizing the harm and burdens of folks who are already in a vulnerable position.
Imagine all the things that we talked about that are incriminating. Now imagine that you didn't do it. That same technology could be used to show that you didn't do it, right? It could be exculpatory. The digital signature that you leave to show that you might leave to show that, for example, somebody else might have left to show that they committed a crime at a particular series of robbery locations. You could have that digital signature and it would show that you weren't there, right? As long as the technology, I think that was just hit up, as long as the technology is available and is not either particularly licensed or unavailable to the defense bar, I can imagine it being just as useful for exonerating somebody as it is for convicting.
If it makes you feel any better, the state of New Jersey's Office of the Public Defender actually has an AI tool. It's called Brief Bank, where they do exactly as he explained. They make it much faster to be able to draft motions, affidavits, and the like, because they have that is in-house built tool based on their own work in the past.
3 quick points. One is that search is an example of a use where a hallucination doesn't matter that much. If it tells you there's this stunning thing on page 20,064 and you go to 20,000, it's not there, no harm done, right? Except you've wasted a little bit of time maybe. This all sounds great and it's true, but I still think that these kinds of things may advantage prosecutors. I mean, there's so much data about us now, and what sometimes you see in prosecutions is you're falsely accused because the government's made an error, and the prosecutors, because they want to save face, they want to charge you with something. Now they have so much data to sift through, and they can find something. Show me them. What's the Robespierre or whatever? He's like, show me the man, and I'll find you the crime. And There's a lot of laws on the books. Like maybe you own some leather that's like, from a rare thing in South America, and it's illegal to own this, we bought, I don't know. That the point is that, a lot of people, there's a lot of gray areas in the law too, where like lots of people break the law, like speeding, right? Like, and so, so there's that. And then the third point I think is just that like, you don't want to be a Luddite. I love tech, but at the same time, this presumption that this is the future can warp people's judgment. Let me give you 2 examples. We have a ton of surveillance cameras all over this country. Almost none of them have microphones. Not because microphones are expensive or difficult, but because our wiretapping statutes make it legally problematic to record people when there's 0 parties present who have presented to the recording in public places. So our laws have constrained the spread of technology. The spread of technology is not inevitable. Everybody thought like we should move to electronic voting machines because they're the future. It's electronic. Let's move to electronic voting machines. Terrible idea. All the experts, all the computer experts like, no, 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 terrible idea. So I would just keep those lessons in mind.
So I am being given the sign to wrap it up because we're already over time, which shows it's a great discussion. First, I would love to thank our 6 panelists. I moderate a lot of things around AI and spend a lot of time thinking about AI. I've not had the opportunity to have such a rich and engaging discussion. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your expertise and just backgrounds. So a huge round of applause. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the ASU law team who behind the scenes put this event on. We couldn't do it without you, so thank you. And to Andrea and Brian for conceptualizing this idea and bringing it to life and bringing these 6 people to the panel. Thank you for all the work that you did. And as Andrea said, we hope that this is one of many events we do in partnership. I know a couple of our panelists have to run for meetings and trains, but those of you who do not, please stay behind. I have a feeling you might have a few more questions coming too. And I would like to officially bring this to a close. The bar is open and the food is coming. So thank you for being with us. I'm like, please go and get a drink. Yeah, I thought I saw. Yeah.